The afternoon light fell sideways across the Colorado Territory in late August of 1875, painting the eastern face of Black Pine Ridge in copper and gold. The mountains held the horizon in a jagged line, their peaks still wearing the last patches of summer snow that had refused to surrender even in the warmest weeks. Down in the long valley where the creek cut its silver thread through the meadow, a small ranch sat with the patient stillness of something built to outlast the men who built it. A pine log house with a roof pitched steeply for winter snow. A barn with straight hung doors. A corral where 40 head of cattle moved slowly through the lake grass. And on the front porch of that house stood a tall man in a dark shirt whose hands were beginning for the first time in 19 years to tremble. His name was Wyatt Calloway. He was 35 years old, and the piece of paper he held in his calloused fingers was about to take everything he owned. The paper had come from the man on horseback who sat watching him from the edge of the yard. Cornelius Drayton, tall in the saddle, silver hair, perfectly combed suit, dustless even after the long ride from town. The kind of man whose smile never reached his eyes because his eyes had work to do. Drayton had spoken in a voice smooth as riverstone, and what he had said was that Wyatt Calloway had signed away the water rights to the North Creek the previous May. $500. Witnessed and notarized. The signature was right there at the bottom of the page in flowing confident ink. Wyatt looked at the paper. Wyatt could not read it. He had not been able to read it on the day he had supposedly signed it. He could not read it now. He had been unable to read for the entirety of his 35 years on this earth, and in the long stretch of those years, he had built a life that had, until this moment, never quite required him to. He could track an elk through 3 feet of snow. He could deliver a calf in a January blizzard. He could read the sky for weather 6 hours before the rain came. But the marks on this paper, those small black shapes arranged in their orderly rows, refused to give up their meaning. They sat there mocking him in their quiet, patient way. His cousin Ridge stepped out of the barn with the slow deliberateness of a man who had heard the conversation and understood every word. 33 years old, lean as winter wood eyes, the color of storm cloud over slate. Ridge did not speak. He did not need to. He moved across the yard and stopped just behind Wyatt's right shoulder, and his presence there was a wall. The other cousin, Asher, 27 years old with curly brown hair and the gentle mouth of a man who had never quite hardened the way the world wanted him to, came out of the workshop wiping wood shavings from his hands. He stopped at the corner of the porch. He said nothing either. But his eyes moved from Wyatt's face to Drayton's face and back again, and in those eyes was the slow gathering of something that looked very much like grief. Drayton smiled. "I imagine," he said, "that you will want some time to consult with your kin. That is reasonable. I am a reasonable man. I will return at the end of the week with my surveyor to mark the new property line. The water that flows through the north section is now legally mine, Mr. Calloway, and I will be diverting it to my own holdings beginning the following Monday. I trust you understand." Wyatt's voice came out low and steady. He had spent his whole life learning how to make his voice steady when his hands were not. "I never signed anything for you." Drayton's smile did not waver. "The paper says you did. The notary says you did. The witnesses say you did, and the paper, Mr. Calloway, is the only thing that matters in a court of law." He let the words hang in the still afternoon air. Then he tipped his hat with a slow, almost gentle gesture and said, "Good afternoon to you, gentlemen," turned his horse and rode away down the trail toward town. The 3 men on the porch did not move. They watched Drayton's back grow smaller against the green of the pines until he disappeared around the bend by the broken fence. They listened to the hoofbeats fade into the evening. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the long grass, indifferent to the catastrophe that had just been delivered to the front porch of the only home any of them had ever known. Wyatt looked down at the paper in his hand. The paper trembled. His hand trembled. He had not trembled like this since the winter he was 16 years old, and stood at the foot of his Aunt Prudence's bed and watched her stop breathing. He folded the paper once, then again, then he folded it a third time and a fourth, until it was a small, thick square he could close his fist around. He put the square in the pocket of his shirt over his heart where it sat like a stone. In 19 years of working in this land, he said quietly, I have never felt so small. Ridge did not answer. Asher did not answer. The three men stood on the porch and watched the sun fall behind the western ridge, and the meadow went from gold to amber to the deep blue of evening, and the first star appeared above the peak of the mountain that had watched over their family for 3 generations. The narrator's voice in the long pause that followed seemed almost to come from the mountain itself. There are things a man fears that he never says aloud. For Wyatt Calloway, there were just 4 words. I cannot read this. That night, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table by the light of a single oil lamp. The folded paper lay between them in the center of the table where Wyatt had placed it like a body at a wake. None of them had eaten. The pot of stew Asher had set on the stove that morning had gone cold and forgotten. Ranger, the old yellow dog, who had come to them as a stray 7 winters earlier, lay under the table with his chin on Asher's boot and his eyes moving from face to face as though he too understood what had happened. Ridge spoke first. He said what they were all thinking. We need someone who can read. Wyatt nodded. Who said Ridge? There was no anger in his voice, only the cold mathematics of a man counting his enemies and finding them everywhere. Who in Black Pine Ridge does not owe Drayton money? Who in this town has the courage to stand against him? The minister who borrows his carriage. The shopkeeper whose store sits on land Drayton owns. The one lawyer in this county has worked for him for 10 years. There is no one. We are alone. Wyatt was silent for a long moment. The lamplight pooled on the worn surface of the table that his Aunt Prudence had bought for $3.50 at an auction in 1857 and had carried up the mountain on the back of a borrowed wagon. He thought of her. He thought of how she had set this same table for 3 motherless boys with nothing in the larder but cornmeal and dried venison, and the stubborn refusal to let any of them go to bed hungry. There is a train, he said. Ridge looked at him. Tomorrow, Wyatt said. 4:30 in the afternoon, Bramwell Sutton sent for a wife from Boston through one of those advertisement papers. She comes in tomorrow. There will be other passengers on that train. Easterners, maybe a teacher, maybe a woman with schooling who needs work. Someone who does not yet owe Drayton anything because she has not yet met him. You are out of your mind, Ridge said. The words came fast and quiet. Bring a stranger up this mountain with Drayton already moving against us. She could be a spy. She could be anything. Or Wyatt said she could be the only chance we have. A long silence settled over the table. The lamp flame guttered in a small draft from under the door, and the shadows on the wall shifted and steadied. Asher, who had not spoken since they sat down, reached across the table and laid his carpenter's hand over the folded paper. His fingers were broad and scarred from years of chisels and saw blades, and there were splinters of pine permanently embedded in the calluses of his palm. Go, he said, to Wyatt. Go and find someone. I will get the back room ready. The one Aunt Prudence used to store seed corn. I will sweep it out and put fresh straw in the mattress and set a jar of wildflowers on the table by the bed. Ridge looked at Asher with something that was not quite exasperation and not quite love, but contained elements of both. He did not argue. When Asher decided a thing, Asher did the thing, and arguing with him was like arguing with weather. Wyatt nodded slowly. Then he said the thing none of them had been saying. Aunt Prudence will want us to fight. Asher smiled, but his eyes were wet. Aunt Prudence, he said, would want us to win. The next morning broke clear and cold over the Callaway Ranch. Wyatt rose before the sun saddled the gray gelding and rode down the long trail toward Black Pine Ridge alone. The trail descended through the pines for the first 2 miles, then opened into the foothills, then flattened into the prairie that ran into the small huddle of buildings that called itself a town. He had been making this ride for 19 years. He knew every turn, every washout, every place where a man could lose his horse if he was careless. He rode it now with his mind elsewhere, his right hand resting on the folded paper in his shirt pocket, as though it might slip free and blow away. He reached the station at 4:15. He tied the gray to the rail, walked to the platform, and stood at the far end where he could see the whole length of the boards. The train arrived at 4:30, exactly trailing a long ribbon of coal smoke that unraveled against a sky the color of aged copper. The wheels squealed against the rails. The conductor stepped down with his small step stool. A handful of passengers descended. Wyatt watched them. A traveling salesman with a sample case. A grandmother with a basket of preserves. A pair of cattlemen from Wyoming Territory whose business he could guess from their boots. And then from the very last car, a young woman. She wore a dark blue dress that had been pressed that morning with great care. White gloves, a small hat with a single silk flower pinned to the brim. A leather trunk sat at her feet where the porter had set it down. She stood very still on the platform with one gloved hand resting on the iron railing of the train car, and her eyes, a deep, startling blue, moved across the platform with the practiced attention of someone cataloging threats. Her back was very straight. Her chin was lifted in a way that suggested she had decided that posture was the last thing the world could not strip from her. Wyatt did not know her name yet, but he watched her, and something in him, some long, quiet thing, turned over once in its sleep. Her name was Adeline Brentwood, and she was 24 years old, and she was about to be publicly destroyed. Bramwell Sutton came up the platform from the direction of the saloon. Wyatt knew him the way you know a man you have nodded to at a dozen cattle auctions but never sat with. Sutton was tall and broad and had a face that might have been handsome in the right light, but the light it found itself in this afternoon was not kind to him. He was walking toward Adeline Brentwood with his shoulders set and his jaw forward, and Wyatt knew what was coming 3 seconds before it arrived. He had seen men carry that posture before, always before they hit something. Sutton stopped 6 feet from her, far enough to make it public, close enough to be heard. "I sent for a wife," he said. The words cracked across the platform like a pistol shot. "Not a woman who thinks she knows more than every man in this territory." The platform went silent, the kind of silence that gathers when people stop breathing at the same time so that they can hear what comes next. The 2 cattlemen turned their heads. The grandmother with the preserves stopped walking. The salesman set down his sample case very slowly. Adeline Brentwood did not move. Her gloved hand stayed on the railing. Her chin stayed up. Sutton was already turning his back to her. "Go back east," he said over his shoulder. "Where women know their place, I will not marry you." He walked away. The crowd parted for him as though Adeline carried disease. The whispers began before he had even cleared the end of the platform. "Too much schooling rots the brain. What kind of woman wants to be smarter than a man?" She had it coming. The phrases landed with the surgical precision of words that had been waiting in mouths for a long time looking for a target. Adeline sat down on her trunk because her legs would no longer hold her. She did not cry. Wyatt saw her not cry. He saw the way her hands trembled, and she pressed them flat against her sides. He saw her throat work once, twice, and then settle. He saw her close her eyes for the space of one long breath, and then open them again, and her chin came back up by some sheer act of will that cost her something Wyatt could not name. He stood at the end of the platform, and he did not move. He was not a man who moved fast in unfamiliar situations. He was a man who watched. He watched her, and he watched the crowd thin, and he watched the train pull out of the station, and he watched the afternoon sun fall a little farther behind the mountains until the platform was almost empty and the woman in the dark blue dress was sitting alone on her trunk with everything she owned in the world at her feet. He thought, this is the woman. He did not know yet why he thought it. He only knew that whatever he had ridden down the mountain looking for, this was it. He walked the length of the platform. His boots made no particular sound on the boards. When he was close enough that she could hear him without him raising his voice, he stopped. He took his hat off and held it in his hands. "You planning to sit there all day," he said. She opened her eyes. They were red but dry, and she looked up at him with a directness that surprised him. She was not what he had expected up close. He had expected fragility. What he found instead was something carved. "I am considering my options," she said. "Does not look like you have many." "Thank you for that observation." Wyatt almost smiled. He had not smiled in 3 days, not since the paper had arrived. The corner of his mouth moved and then stopped. He glanced over his shoulder. Ridge had ridden in behind him sometime in the last hour. He had not asked Ridge to come, and he was not surprised that Ridge had come anyway. Ridge stood at the far end of the platform with his arms crossed, watching the two of them, with an expression that Wyatt could read as easily as a printed page, even though he could not read printed pages. The expression said, "I do not trust this." The expression also said, "I am not leaving you alone with this decision." Asher was not there. Asher was at the ranch sweeping out the back room and arranging a jar of purple and yellow wildflowers on the table beside a freshly made bed. Wyatt turned back to the woman. "My name is Wyatt Calloway," he said. "The man at the end of the platform is my cousin Ridge. We have a third cousin named Asher who is at our ranch. I have a proposition for you, miss." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I am not interested in propositions, Mr. Calloway." "Not that kind," he said quickly, and to his surprise his face went a little hot. He cleared his throat. "I need a teacher. You appear to need employment. That is all there is to it." She studied him for a long moment. Why, she said, would 3 men living on a mountain need a teacher? And here it was. The thing he had not said aloud in 19 years. The thing his Aunt Prudence had told him gently and firmly that he should never tell strangers. The thing that had cost him so much already and was about to cost him everything if he did not finally speak it. He looked her in the eye. "Because I cannot read," he said. He said it very quietly, but the words came out steady. A pause. "None of us can. Not one word. And there is a man in this town who has just produced a piece of paper claiming I sold him my water rights, and I cannot prove I did not because I cannot read what the paper says." Something moved in her face. Not pity. Pity he would have refused. What moved in her face was something else, something more complicated. It was the look of a person recognizing that she had just been handed a key that might unlock a room she had been waiting all her life to enter. "You need a lawyer," she said, "not a teacher. Lawyers want money I do not have," he said, "and they use words I do not understand." He paused. "I need someone who can teach me to fight back using the same weapons they are using against me." She did not answer right away. She looked down at her gloved hands. She looked at her trunk, which contained everything she owned in the world, including a Bible with her mother's handwriting on the first page and $4 sewn into the lining of her handbag. She looked back up at him. How much, she said. $30 a month, room and board separate. Your own quarters. I want 40. I do not have 40. Then we are finished, she said, and she began to lower herself back onto the trunk. He caught her elbow, gently but firm. 35, he said, the most I can manage and still feed 4 people. From the end of the platform, Ridge made a small sound that was not quite a word, but contained several opinions. Wyatt ignored him. 35, Adeline said, and anything I earn from teaching others in addition, and I want it written down. For the first time in 3 days, Wyatt Calloway smiled. The smile transformed his face. The severity fell away. What remained was a warmth so unexpected that Adeline blinked once, surprised by it, and looked at him as though she were seeing him for the first time. That, he said, is exactly why I am hiring you. Asher was waiting in the yard when the wagon came around the last bend. He had heard the wheels on the road for nearly 20 minutes before they appeared. He had been standing on the porch with his hands in the pockets of his work pants, watching the trail. When the wagon came into view, with 3 figures and a leather trunk, he did not run forward. He simply lifted Ranger from where the dog had been pressing against his legs, set him down, and walked out to meet them. He moved the trunk himself. He carried it to the back room and set it down beside the bed without a word. The jar of wildflowers stood on the small pine table by the window, purple and yellow, the same colors that grew along the fence line where Aunt Prudence had planted the first ones 30 years before. Adeline stood in the doorway of the room and did not speak for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you." Asher had not yet said a single word to her. He looked at her now, and his brown eyes held something old and patient. He said, "Aunt Prudence used to say a person should be welcomed with flowers. She said it cost nothing and meant everything." He left her Anita. He walked out of the room and closed the door behind him with the soft, careful click of a man who had built that door himself and knew exactly how it fit in its frame. Adeline stood alone in the small room and looked at the wildflowers and at the bed and at the small window that faced the eastern slope of the mountain. The late afternoon light was turning the meadow to gold and the creek to silver and the farthest peaks to a shade of blue that did not exist anywhere in Boston and had no name in any language she knew. She set her trunk down. She removed her hat. She removed her gloves and laid them on the table beside the wildflowers. She did not cry then either, but she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and breathed for a long time, and she thought of her mother Beatrice, and she thought of her father Hollister, and she thought of the $4 sewn into her handbag, and she thought of the man on the platform who had said the word marriage as though it were a kind of disease. And she thought of the other man, the tall man with the green and gold eyes, who had taken his hat off when he spoke to her and had said the words, "I cannot read," in a voice that contained no apology and no shame, only the truth. She thought, "I do not know what this place is, but it is mine. That is enough." The first lesson took place that very evening at the kitchen table. Wyatt had insisted. The papers were to come out, and they were to begin now before another sun rose over a Calloway ranch where 4 people sat around a table and only one of them could read. Adeline produced a small slate and a piece of chalk from her trunk. She set them on the table. She wrote the letter A. "This is the letter A," she said. "It makes the sound A as in apple. It is the first letter of the alphabet, and once you know all 26 of them, you can read anything that has ever been written in the English language. A man, an article, a contract." She wrote the letter B. This is the letter B. It makes the sound B as in barn. She wrote the letter C, then D, then E. The three men sat across from her and watched the chalk move across the slate. Ridge had positioned himself at the far end of the table arms, folded posture radiating the message that he was present under protest and considered the entire exercise a waste of his time. But his eyes followed the chalk. Asher leaned forward with his chin on his hand and watched with the absorbed attention of a child at his first sermon. Wyatt sat directly across from her, his hands flat on the table on either side of a piece of paper she had set in front of him. "Try to copy the A," she said to him. "Just the shape. Do not worry about the seesaw or the angle, just the shape." Wyatt picked up the pencil, his hand a hand that had broken horses and felled trees and dressed deer carcasses by lantern light in the snow closed around the small wooden shaft as though it were an alien object. He pressed the pencil to the paper. What he drew did not look like an A. It looked like something a small spider might leave behind if it had been crushed. He stared at it, his jaw tightened. He tried again, worse. A third time. The lead snapped. He flung the pencil across the room. It struck the far wall and bounced into the corner, where Ranger raised his head briefly and then settled back down with a sigh. "Useless," Wyatt said. The word came out flat and bitter. "I am 35 years old, and I cannot draw a single letter." Adeline did not move. Her voice did not change. "Not useless," she said. "Difficult. Those are different things." Wyatt's eyes came up sharp and angry, and for a moment Adeline thought he might say something that would end the lesson and possibly the employment. But she held his gaze. "Could I do what you do?" she said. "Saddle a horse, mend a fence in a blizzard, track a mountain lion through timber, keep 2 men alive through 19 winters on this mountain." "No," she answered for him. "Then we both have something to learn. The question, Mr. Calloway, is whether you have the courage to continue when it is hard or whether you will walk away. Are you calling me a coward? I am asking whether you are one." Something flared in his eyes. Then slowly, like a fire damping itself down to coals, it faded, and what replaced it was something Adeline had not expected to find on the face of a man who had hurled a pencil across a room 30 seconds before. It was the first seed of respect. He stood up. He walked across the room. He picked up the pencil. He came back to the table. He sat down. He pressed the pencil to the paper. He drew the letter A. It still looked like a crushed spider, but it was a slightly larger crushed spider, and it was recognizably the letter A. Adeline smiled. It was a small smile, brief, but it reached her eyes for the first time since the platform. "Good," she said. "Now do it again." The lesson went on for 2 hours. By the end of it, Wyatt could draw the first 5 letters of the alphabet. Asher could draw the first 10 and was beginning to ask questions about words. Ridge had not picked up a pencil at all, but his chair had moved 2 inches closer to the table at some point during the second hour, and Adeline had pretended not to notice. When she finally set down the chalk and said that was enough for one night, Asher gathered the papers and stacked them carefully, and put them in a drawer of the cabinet his Aunt Prudence had brought up the mountain in 1854. Wyatt walked out onto the porch and stood looking at the stars. Ridge went to the barn to check on the horses for the second time that evening, which was something he did when he needed to think. Adeline sat alone at the kitchen table with the oil lamp burning low. She opened her handbag. She took out the small leather Bible with her mother's handwriting on the first page. She traced the letters with her fingertip. "Born to read," the page said. "Born to teach. Born to be exactly who you are." She sat there for a long time. Outside on the porch, Wyatt heard her stand and walk to her room and close the door. He heard the small sounds of her preparing for sleep, The rustle of fabric, the creak of the bed, then silence. He stood on the porch and looked at the mountain and thought about the folded paper in his shirt pocket. He thought about Cornelius Drayton. He took the paper out. He unfolded it. He looked at the marks on it, the small black shapes that had cost him so much already and might yet cost him everything. For the first time in his life, he could find the letter A on the page. It appeared 7 times. He counted them with his finger. It was not much. It was not nearly enough. But it was 7 more letters than he had been able to find that morning, and the woman who had taught him to find them was sleeping in his back room, and the wildflowers Asher had cut from along the fence line stood on the table beside her bed, and the mountain that his Aunt Prudence had loved more than any place on earth was holding its old patient watch over all of it. He folded the paper again. He put it back in his pocket. The next morning, the lesson would begin again, and the morning after that, and every morning after that, for as long as it took. He went inside, he blew out the lamp, he went to his own bed. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. The pattern that would govern the rest of their autumn established itself with the quiet inevitability of a creek finding its channel. Mornings were for ranch work. Adeline learned to gather eggs from chickens that pecked her ankles, to milk the patient old cow named Bessie, to haul water from the creek in 2 heavy wooden buckets that left her arms aching by noon. She did not complain. Asher watched her from the doorway of the workshop one morning and said quietly, "It gets easier." "Does it?" she said. "No, but you get better at it." Evenings were for reading. By the end of the first week, Wyatt could write his own name. He sat at the table for an hour after the others had gone to bed, writing it over and over on a piece of paper Adeline had given him. Wyatt Calloway, Wyatt Calloway, Wyatt Calloway. The letters were uneven and the spacing was wrong, and the W kept tilting too far to the right, but they were his. He had made them. When he finally laid down the pencil and stood up from the table, he walked out onto the porch, and he did not go to bed for a long time. He stood looking at the stars over the mountain, and his eyes were wet, and he was glad nobody could see him. Asher learned faster than either of the other two. His visual memory was extraordinary. A letter seen once was remembered permanently, its shape filed away with the same precision he brought to carving wood. By the 3rd evening, he was writing whole sentences. The cat sat on the mat. The dog ran in the yard. The man rode a horse. They were small sentences, the kind a child might write, but he wrote them with a steadiness that made Adeline stop and stare. "You have a gift," she told him. Asher's brown eyes brightened, and he looked down at the paper to hide what was rising behind them. "Aunt Prudence would be happy," he said softly. The room went still. Wyatt stopped writing. Ridge from his distant chair became motionless. Nobody spoke. Prudence Calloway, the woman who had raised 3 fatherless boys on a mountain and given them everything except the one thing she could not, would have wept with joy to see her youngest writing sentences by lamplight. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was full of everything that did not need to be said. Ridge resisted longer than the others. He sat at the far end of the table with his arms crossed for the entire first week, watching the lessons without ever picking up a pencil. But Adeline was watching too, and she noticed his eyes. Each time she guided Wyatt through a word, Ridge's gray-blue gaze tracked her finger on the page. He was learning while pretending not to. On the 2nd evening of the 2nd week, she left a sheet with the alphabet on the table when she went to bed. The next morning it had been moved, picked up, studied, replaced in almost but not quite the same position. She said nothing. The next evening his chair was 2 inches closer. The evening after that he asked his first question. "What letter is that?" he said, pointing. That is the letter K, Adeline said, as though answering the most ordinary question in the world. He repeated, kind of like a man with his arms out. Yes, she said, exactly like that. He nodded. He did not ask another question that night, but the next evening he asked two. The wall was cracking, inch by inch, letter by letter. On the eighth day, Adeline asked Wyatt to bring out the papers. The three of them sat around the table. The folded paper from Cornelius Drayton came out of Wyatt's shirt pocket where it had been living for a week and a half. Adeline unfolded it carefully and smoothed it flat on the table between them. She placed it next to two other papers Wyatt had produced from a drawer. Papers, he said, had been delivered to him over the past year that he had never been able to read and had simply put away in case they mattered. She read the first one aloud, her finger tracing each word. This is a contract, she said. It states that you, Wyatt Calloway, agree to sell the water rights to the North Creek of your property to Cornelius Drayton for the sum of $500. Wrong, Wyatt said. I have never sold anything to Drayton. Your signature appears at the bottom. That is not how I write my name. She studied the signature. It was flowing, confident, the pen stroke smooth and practiced. Nothing like the careful, hesitant handwriting she would expect from a man who had learned to write his own name only in the past week. You are right, she said slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster with recognition. This is not your handwriting. She looked at the second paper. It was another contract. This one claimed that Wyatt had agreed to grant Drayton grazing rights on the western pasture. The signature at the bottom was also Wyatt Calloway. She looked at the third paper. A right-of-way agreement, allowing Drayton's men to cross the northern boundary at will. Signed Wyatt Calloway. She placed all three signatures side by side under the lamp. Her finger hovered over them. All three are identical, she said. The slant, the pressure, the way the letters connect. Look at the way the W begins. Look at how the Y descends. These are not three signatures made on 3 different days by a man trying to write his own name. These are 3 signatures made by the same hand all at once by a person who knew exactly what they were doing. She lifted her eyes to Wyatt. Someone forged your signature on every one of these contracts. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes a room. It expanded outward from the table and pushed itself into the corners and pressed against the walls and the windows in the door. Ranger, who had been asleep under the table, lifted his head. Asher's hand, which had been resting on the edge of the paper, drew back slowly. Ridge, at the far end of the table, leaned forward for the first time in a week. Wyatt did not move. He did not speak. He looked at the 3 signatures, and then he looked up at Adeline, and his eyes had gone a color she had not seen in them before. The green and gold had darkened. There was something in them now that was very still and very cold. He spoke a single word. Drayton. The name hung between them in the lamplight. In that moment, the story ceased to be about a rejected bride from Boston and a mail-order arrangement gone wrong. It became something larger and older. It became a story about land, about power, about the ancient crime of those who could read against those who could not, about a man named Cornelius Drayton, who somewhere behind the silver hair and the dustless suits and the smooth voice that had wrecked dozens of lives in this county was sitting in a fine house in town tonight, believing that the Calloway Ranch was as good as taken. Ridge spoke. His voice was low and rough. 12 years, he said. 12 years he has been doing this. To how many people, how many families have lost their land because they could not read what he handed them? Asher said nothing. His brown eyes had gone dark with something beyond anger, a deep grief for everyone who had never had the chance these 3 men were now being given by the woman across the table from them. Adeline took a breath. She looked at the 3 of them. The three Calloway men whose lives had bent around this kitchen table and around each other for nearly 2 decades. The three men whose Aunt Prudence had loved them so fiercely that she had given them everything she had, and then died too soon to give them the one thing they needed most. "We will do two things at once," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "I will teach all three of you to read, not just to sign your names, to understand contracts, to read the law, to fight. And while I am doing that, we will find a way to prove this signature is a forgery." "How?" said Ridge. "Sharp, practical, already moving." "By comparison," she said, "Drayton has signed many legitimate transactions. He has bought land from willing sellers. He has signed receipts. He has registered businesses. Every one of those papers will have his real signature on it. They are filed at the county records office. If the forged signature on these contracts matches the real handwriting on those documents, that is evidence. Real evidence. A handwriting expert in Denver could verify it. A judge could rule on it." Wyatt was looking at her. His eyes had not changed. They were still, very cold. But there was something else in them now, something she had not seen before, something she did not yet have a name for. "You came from Boston on a train with $4, he said quietly. "And in 8 days you have given us more hope than 19 years combined." Adeline did not know what to say to that. She looked down at the three forged signatures on the table. She looked at the Bible on the shelf by the door, the one she had not yet shown them, the one with her mother's handwriting on the first page. "Born to teach," the page said. She lifted her eyes. "We start tomorrow," she said. And outside, beyond the small lit window of the cabin, where four people sat around a kitchen table by lamplight, the Colorado night stretched on ancient and vast. The mountain kept its eternal watch. The creek ran its ceaseless course toward the valley below. The wolves called from the far ridge in voices older than any human song. And somewhere down in the town of Black Pine Ridge, in a fine house with carpet on the floors and books on the shelves of a man who could read every one of them, Cornelius Drayton sat in front of his fire and counted the days until Monday, when his men would arrive at the Calloway Ranch with surveyors, stakes, and rope. He did not know what was coming for him. He did not know that the woman he had heard about from Bramwell Sutton, the rejected bride who had stepped off the train and been humiliated on the platform, and had then disappeared up the mountain with three illiterate Calloway men, was at this very moment sitting at their kitchen table, teaching them how to read his crimes back to him. He did not know that 12 years of stolen land and broken families and one woman drowned in a frozen creek were about to come together in a single trial, in a single courtroom, in a single town in the Colorado Territory. He did not know that the mountain was patient and that what the mountain begins, it tends to finish. He poured himself another glass of brandy. He looked into the fire. He smiled the smile of a man who had never lost. And up on the ridge in the lamplight, Wyatt Calloway picked up a pencil and began very slowly and very carefully to write the letter A. The second week on the Calloway Ranch began with frost on the meadow grass, and the first hard hint that summer was over. Adeline woke before dawn to the smell of wood smoke and bacon and the particular cold silence that only mountain mornings produce. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair, and stepped out into the porch into a world that had been turned silver overnight. The frost lay across the meadow like a fine white sheet, and the creek below the house ran with a fresh sharpness she could hear from a quarter-mile away. Her breath made small clouds in the air. She had never seen anything so beautiful in her life. The three men were already at work. Wyatt was splitting wood by the side of the barn, the steady rhythm of the axe head meeting pine traveling across the clear morning air. Ridge was up on the north ridge with a rifle across his back, walking the fence line, his eyes on the timber beyond it. Asher was inside the barn, the sound of his hammer ringing against the anvil in a slow, patient cadence that meant he was shaping something rather than fixing something. Ranger came up to her on the porch and pressed his old yellow head against her knee. She knelt and put her arms around the dog. She had been on this mountain for 9 days, and already the place had begun to feel less like a refuge and more like something that belonged to her. The ranch had a rhythm, the men had a rhythm, and she somehow had found her own place in that rhythm. Morning she helped where she could. Afternoon she prepared lessons or worked through whatever document Wyatt had set aside for her to read aloud. Evening she taught. The lessons had begun to reveal each man in a way she suspected they had never been revealed before, even to one another. Wyatt attacked every lesson the way another man might attack a stand of timber that needed clearing. He set his jaw and bent his head and went at the work with a ferocious, silent intensity that nothing seemed able to break. He wrote his name 100 times. He wrote contract 200 times. He wrote signature, witness agreement, deed lien easement until those words began to appear on the back of every scrap of paper in the house. The trembling in his hands faded. The letters straightened. By the end of the second week, he could read aloud slowly and with effort but accurately the first 3 pages of a children's primer Adeline had brought from her trunk. The night he finished the third page, he stood up from the table without a word and walked outside. Adeline found him on the porch 10 minutes later. He was not crying. He was simply standing there with his hands on the porch rail, looking out at the dark shape of the mountain. "I never thought I would do this," he said. She did not answer. "I thought," he said, "I would die on this mountain the way Aunt Prudence died, with my mark instead of my name on the papers they sent me, with other men deciding what those papers meant." He turned and looked at her. "You changed that," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You changed it. I just gave you the alphabet." He looked at her with the full weight of his green and gold eyes. He did not speak again. He did not need to. He stood beside her on the porch in the cold mountain dark, and the silence between them was the kind that two people only achieve when they have begun without saying so to recognize each other. Asher learned faster than any student Adeline had ever taught, including the bright girls at the Garrett Academy. His memory was visual and absolute. He saw a letter once, and the letter was his. By the end of the second week, he was reading from her copy of the King James Bible, working through Genesis with the slow, careful pace of a craftsman fitting joinery. He read for the pleasure of reading. He read aloud to himself in the workshop while he carved. He read to Ranger in the evenings, the dog stretched beside him on the rug with his chin on his paws. One night, Adeline came in from a walk and found Asher at the kitchen table with one of her books open and tears on his face. He did not try to hide them. He looked up at her and smiled, and his smile was the smile of a man who had just discovered that the thing he had been told all his life was not for him had in fact been waiting for him all along. "Aunt Prudence used to read to us," he said, "out of her own Bible. Before bed, she would point at the words, and we would watch the words, and we thought we were learning. Then the day came when she sat down and asked Wyatt to read a verse to her. He could not. None of us could. We had been watching her finger on the page for 10 years, and we had never once learned to read." He paused. "I think she knew," he said. "I think she knew she could not teach what she did not know. But she pretended for our sake, so that we would have at least a memory of someone reading to us, so that he would know what it sounded like." Adeline sat down at the table beside him. She did not speak. She put her hand on his shoulder and left it there, And after a long moment, Asher closed the Bible very gently and laid his hand on top of hers, the way a man might lay his hand on the lid of a coffin. "She is not gone," Adeline said. "She is in this room every night. She is in every word you read." Asher nodded. He could not speak. Ridge was the slowest to give in, and his giving in came in the smallest increments of any man Adeline had ever taught. The cracks in his armor opened one hairline fracture at a time. By the end of the second week, his chair was almost at the table. By the middle of the third week, he had picked up a pencil. By the end of the third week, he could write the words, "Yes, no, mine hours, mountain water family." But he would not say so. He would not admit that he was learning. He kept his face like a stone wall, and only the slow migration of his chair and the slow accumulation of letters on the back of an old shipping receipt he kept folded in his pocket told the story of what he was actually doing. One night, when only Ridge and Adeline were left at the table because Wyatt had gone to bed early with a hard cough, and Asher was in the workshop carving by candlelight, Ridge said without looking at her, "You remind me of someone." Adeline waited. "My mother," he said, "the woman who left." She did not respond. She had learned by now that with Ridge, the wrong response was almost always a question. "She came out of the East," he said. "Boston, I think, or somewhere near it. She married my father when he came back from the goldfields with nothing in his pockets, and she thought he had something she could shape. She was wrong. He had nothing for her to shape. He drank, and she stayed, and she stayed, and she stayed. And then one morning when I was 8 years old, she put me in a wagon with the man she called Mr. Travers, and she rode with me down to a roadhouse outside Denver, and she told me to wait inside while she fetched something from the wagon, and she did not come back." The lamp guttered. Adeline did not move. Ridge looked at her finally. His gray-blue eyes were dry but old. "You came up this mountain," he said, "and I thought you would do the same thing. I thought the first hard wind would blow you off. I thought when Drayton came, I would watch you go. I thought I had your number." He paused. "I was wrong," he said, "about every part of it." Adeline did not know what to say. She felt that anything she said would be too much. So she said the small, true thing. "I am sorry," she said. "About your mother." Ridge nodded. He looked down at the paper in front of him. He picked up the pencil. He wrote in slow, careful letters the word "stayed." Then he wrote beneath it the word "stay." He did not say anything else. But when she went to bed that night, she heard him sitting up at the table for a long time, the scratch of the pencil moving steadily. The peace of those weeks broke on the morning of the 18th day. Adeline was at the kitchen table with Ridge working on the difference between the words "sell" and "lease a small private victory," that he had agreed to the lesson at all, and was asking questions instead of pretending indifference. 3 weeks of progress fragile as new ice, and Adeline was careful not to acknowledge it too directly, because acknowledging it would make Ridge retreat. She had learned this about him. He was like a wild animal that would eat from her hand only if she pretended not to notice. Then the hoofbeats reached them through the open window, not the easy rhythm of a traveler, the hard, purposeful gallop of someone arriving with intent. Wyatt was on his feet before Adeline had fully registered the sound, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip, with the unconscious ease of a man who had been reaching for weapons since childhood. Ridge was at the window in 2 strides, his gray-blue eyes narrowing to slits. Asher rose from the corner, where he had been sharpening a chisel, and without a word picked up the carpenter's hammer that leaned against the table. 4 people moved into position as though they had rehearsed it 100 times, which in a way, through years of living where danger could arrive with the weather they had. One rider, Ridge said from the window. "Black horse coming fast," Tilton Wyatt said. "Drayton's man." They stepped outside together. All four. The fact that Adeline walked out with them was not lost on Reeves Tilton. When he reined his horse to a halt in the yard, the animal stamping and blowing foam at its neck. Tilton was a lean man with a narrow face built for meanness, small eyes that sat too close together, and the look of someone who had learned early that cruelty was easier than kindness and had never bothered to unlearn it. His gaze swept from Wyatt to Adeline, lingered on her longer than necessary, then moved to Ridge and Asher and back to Adeline. Calloway, his voice was thin and sharp. Heard you hired yourself a tutor. Whole town is talking, wondering why you would bring a woman up the mountain, unless you have got something to hide. Wyatt stepped forward, placing himself between Tilton and Adeline. But Adeline moved to his side. She did not need anyone standing in front of her. Mr. Calloway's financial arrangements are none of your concern, she said. Tilton's eyes found hers. You have got a mouth on you, lady. I have a mind behind it and the vocabulary to express it. If that threatens you, I suggest you consider why. For a moment, Tilton's face went blank with surprise. He was not accustomed to being challenged by a woman half his size who did not raise her voice. Ridge had moved to Wyatt's other side, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Asher stood behind Adeline, not blocking her, but present. The formation was instinctive, a wall built from trust and years. Tilton spurred his horse forward, close enough that Adeline had to step back to avoid the animal's shoulder. Wyatt caught the bridle and held it. Touch her again, he said, his voice barely audible, and you will not ride home. Tilton wrenched the reins free, wheeled his horse, and paused at the edge of the yard. You are all making a mistake. Then he was gone, dust rising behind him like a curtain drawn across a stage. In the silence that followed, four people stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats fade. The dust settled. A meadowlark called from the fence post, oblivious to the fact that the world had just become more dangerous. Ranger, who had been hiding under the porch during Tilton's visit, emerged cautiously and pressed himself against Adeline's leg, trembling. Adeline knelt and put her arms around the dog. Her hands were shaking too, though she would not have admitted this if asked. Ridge spoke, not to Wyatt, to Adeline. You held your ground. He said it the way another man might have said, you survived an avalanche, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation that carried within it a grudging revision of opinion. From Ridge Calloway, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me yet, he said. It is going to get considerably worse. I know, she said. Wyatt looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that he did not yet have words for, either spoken or emotional. He turned and walked toward the barn without speaking, because Wyatt Calloway expressed his feelings the way mountains expressed their geology, slowly and through accumulation, and almost never with words. That evening the four of them planned. Adeline laid out the strategy at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low between them. We need to prove who forged the signatures, she said. If Drayton did it himself, we compare his handwriting on his own legitimate transactions with the forgeries on your contracts. County land records. Ridge said, sharp and practical. Drayton has bought dozens of properties. Every transaction requires his signature. Every transaction will be on file at the records office in town. Adeline nodded. The plan was simple in the way that dangerous plans usually are. Sunday morning, when the entire town would be at church and the records office would sit unattended with only its single unlocked door between them and 12 years of evidence, Wyatt and Adeline would slip inside. Ridge would watch the street. Asher would take the ridge above town with a small homemade telescope he had built for himself, out of a brass tube and 2 ground lenses he had bought from a peddler. Sunday came under a sky so blue it looked painted. The streets of Black Pine Ridge were empty. Hymns drifted from the church voices, earnest if not beautiful, the singing of people who believed someone was listening. Wyatt and Adeline walked down the boardwalk with the casual pace of two people who had nothing in particular to hide. Ridge was in the alley behind the dry goods store with a clear view of both ends of the main street. Asher was a quarter-mile up the hill behind the town with the brass telescope to his eye and a small mirror tied to his hat for signaling. The records office was unlocked. In a town where no one would think to steal land documents, locks were an unnecessary expense. Adeline found Drayton's transaction files within minutes, dozens of them spanning a decade each one, representing a family that had lost everything. She pulled 5 of the most recent and spread them beside the forged contracts she had brought in her bag. Her heart began to beat faster. The signatures were not merely similar. They were identical. The same slant, the same pressure, the same way the letters connected. Cornelius Drayton had signed his own name on his legitimate purchases and had signed Wyatt Calloway's name on the forgeries with the same hand. He did it himself, Wyatt whispered. He was standing beside her close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a stove. The same hand. His voice carried the particular quality of a man absorbing a truth that was simultaneously obvious and devastating. The way the answer to a question you have been asking for years can arrive and feel both inevitable and shocking at the same time. For 12 years, Cornelius Drayton had been stealing from families who could not read. For 12 years, he had been forging signatures with the same hand that signed his own name on legitimate documents, leaving a trail that any handwriting expert could follow if only someone had thought to look. And no one had looked, because the people being stolen from could not read the evidence of their own theft, and the people who could read had no reason to care. Adeline was copying furiously, her pen racing across paper, recording every detail that might matter in a courtroom when Ridge's signal came. A short, sharp whistle from outside. Then the door opened. Cornelius Drayton filled the doorway. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed gray eyes, cold as January creek water. He took in the scene with the calculating patience of a man who had spent decades assessing situations and finding them to his advantage. "Well," he said, "this is interesting." "Public records," Adeline said, "public building." On a Sunday when the offices closed, his smile did not reach his eyes. "Convenient." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He did not raise his voice. He had never been a man who needed to. "I will offer you cash today," he said to Wyatt, "a figure to make a man's children rich. The land, the water rights, all of it. You walk away with more money than your family has seen in 3 generations." The figure he named was staggering. Adeline felt her breath catch despite herself. But Wyatt did not hesitate. "No, you have not heard the amount. Do not need to. The land is not for sale." 2 words that carried the weight of graves and sweat and 19 years of survival. Drayton turned to Adeline, the rejected bride. "Bramwell told me everything he said. About you, about Boston, about the way you stepped off that train and stood there with $4 and nowhere to go." He stepped closer. "What happens when you lose Miss Brentwood? When the case fails and the ranch is gone? You will be set back where you started, alone, penniless, unwanted. There will be no train to take you anywhere. There will be no mountain to take you in. You will be exactly what you were on that platform. Less even." She looked him straight in the eye. "I would rather lose with dignity than win by theft," she said. Then something unexpected. Drayton paused at this door. The cruelty dropped from his voice, replaced by something that might have been honesty. "My father had land once, Miss Brentwood. Good land back east. He believed in fairness, in justice, and they took everything. Banks, lawyers, men in fine suits like the one I wear now. They took it all and left him to die in a ditch. I watched him die, not from disease, from losing everything that made him who he was. He paused. The only difference between me and Calloway is that I learned not to be the one who loses. Then the mask returned. He mentioned casually that it would be unfortunate if anything happened to Miss Brentwood on that remote ranch. The threat was clear. Wyatt stepped forward, but Drayton was already gone. Through the door into the bright Sunday street, walking away with the unhurried stride of a man who had said what he came to say. Ridge appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, his face dark. I heard everything he said. He threatened her. I know, Wyatt said. His voice was rougher than Adeline had ever heard it. The next morning brought Sheriff Aldous Finch riding up the trail with the posture of a man performing a duty he was ashamed of. Drayton had filed a complaint, trespassing, theft. 3 witnesses, all Drayton employees, claimed to have seen Adeline steal documents from the records office. Finch wanted to search their belongings. If he found the copies, their evidence, everything would be lost. Do you have a warrant? Wyatt asked. Do not need one if you consent. I do not consent. Finch's voice dropped. The weariness in it was not performance, but the real exhaustion of a man drowning in small increments. Calloway, he said, I have a sick wife. Do you know what medicine costs out here? Do you know what Drayton pays a county sheriff? I am not a bad man. I am a man who cannot keep his head above water. Wyatt looked at him for a long time, with the eyes that read people better than they read words. Then maybe it is time to stop drowning, Tom. Maybe it is time to stand up. Finch was silent. Then he lowered his hand from his holster. I will come back tomorrow with a warrant, he said. You had best be here. He turned and rode away, and Adeline understood that he had given them time. Not much, but enough. The decision was immediate. Wyatt and Adeline would ride for Denver to find a handwriting expert. Ridge and Asher would stay to guard the ranch. I do not like splitting up, Ridge said. Neither do I, Wyatt said. But there is no other way. He gripped Ridge's shoulder. You are the one I trust most to protect this place. Ridge's jaw tightened. Then he nodded. Asher pulled Adeline aside. Watch over him, he said. Wyatt carries everything alone. He will not show you when he is tired. Then quieter, and be careful. Not just of Drayton. Of him too. What do you mean? He has never looked at anyone the way he looks at you, and he will not know what to do with that. They rode through the night, taking game trails and forest paths to avoid the main road where Drayton's men might be watching. Ridge created false tracks leading north before they left a trick Aunt Prudence had taught him years ago, brushing the real trail behind them with pine branches until the marks disappeared into the forest floor. 2 days of hard riding through mountain country, sleeping in shifts, eating jerky and creek water, speaking little. The second afternoon, they reached a small town called Ridgefield, population perhaps 200, where no one knew their names or their trouble. They bought train tickets to Denver with cash, gave false names to the ticket clerk, and boarded a westbound car that smelled of coal dust and tobacco, and the particular wariness of people traveling long distances with uncertain hopes. On the train, Adeline watched the landscape flatten from mountains to foothills to plains, the country opening up like a book being spread wide. And she thought about her mother. Beatrice Brentwood had never been farther west than Philadelphia. She had taught Adeline about the frontier from books and maps and the stories of others, the way people teach about places they have never been, but somehow understand. Adeline wondered what Beatrice would make of all this. The mountains, the 3 men who could not read, the forged contracts, the man behind them. The fact that her daughter, who had been trained to parse sentences and analyze legal documents in a Boston academy, was now riding a train across Colorado territory with a mountain man she was falling in love with, heading to a city she had never seen to find an expert she had never met to fight a battle she was not certain she could win. Beatrice would have approved. Beatrice would have said this was exactly the kind of thing that education was for. Wyatt sat beside her on the hard wooden bench, his hat on his knees, his eyes on the passing landscape. He had not been to Denver in 3 years. The last time he had come to buy a plow blade and had been cheated by a merchant who added extra charges to a receipt Wyatt could not read. The memory still burned. "But this time will be different," Adeline said, though he had not spoken. He looked at her. "How did you know what I was thinking?" "Because you touched the scar on your hand when you are remembering something that hurt you." He looked down at his right hand at the crescent-shaped scar on the knuckles where a horse rope had bitten years ago and realized she was right. He had been rubbing it without knowing. In Denver, Adeline sold her mother's jewelry. The pawnbroker's shop was on a narrow street near the rail yards, a dim room that smelled of metal polish and old marked velvet, its glass cases filled with the surrendered possessions of people who had run out of options. Adeline placed 3 items on the counter. The gold necklace with the small sapphire that her father had given her mother on the day they married. The one Beatrice wore every Sunday and some weekdays too. The one that caught the light when she leaned over the table to help Adeline sound out words from the family Bible. The silver wedding band that had belonged to her grandmother. A plain ring worn thin by 50 years of constant wear. A ring that had never left the old woman's finger until the day she was buried. And the earrings. Small pearls set in gold that Hollister Brentwood had given Beatrice on their 20th anniversary. The earrings she had been wearing the evening she taught Adeline to read her very first book, a volume of nursery rhymes whose pages had been turned so many times the corners were soft as cloth. $400, the pawnbroker said. He counted the bills onto the counter with the practiced indifference of a man who had bought other people's memories 1,000 times and had learned not to think about what they meant. Adeline took the money. She did not cry, not inside the shop. Outside on the sidewalk, with the noise of Denver traffic around her, the rattle of carriages and the shout of vendors and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from across the street, she pressed her palms against her eyes and allowed herself 30 seconds of grief. 30 seconds for the necklace. 30 seconds for the ring. 30 seconds for the earrings her mother wore when she opened the book and pointed to the first word and said, "This one says cat. Can you say cat?" 30 seconds for the last physical evidence that Beatrice Brentwood had ever existed on this earth. Wyatt stood beside him. He did not speak. He did not say it would be all right. He did not tell her she was brave. He did not offer any of the hollow words that people use to fill the space around someone else's pain. He simply stood there, his shoulder touching hers, as solid and silent as the mountains they had left behind, and let her grieve. When she lowered her hands and drew a breath and straightened her back, he was still there. He would always be there. This was how love began between them. Not with words, with presence, with the willingness to stand beside someone in their worst moment and offer nothing except the fact of being there. Then Wyatt did something that Adeline would remember for the rest of her life. He reached into his vest pocket and drew out a silver pocket watch. It was old. The chain was tarnished. Inscribed inside the case in a careful script were the words, "To my son, Wyatt, never forget who you are. Father, 1857. It was the only thing he had left of his father, who had died in the logging accident when Wyatt was 7 years old. He laid it on the counter beside Adeline's jewelry. "Add this in," he said to the pawnbroker. Adeline did not say anything. She did not need to. Some kind of love did not require words, only proof. They found Professor Bartholomew Reeve in a third-floor office at the University of Denver that looked as though a library had exploded inside it. Books stacked on every surface, papers covering the desk in geological layers, a magnifying glass the size of a saucer, three different pairs of spectacles, and behind it all, a man of 73 with white hair that went in four directions, a vest missing one button, and eyes that were sharper than any blade Wyatt had ever sharpened on a whetstone. Reeve listened to their story without interruption, which was unusual for him, because Bartholomew Reeve had opinions about everything and rarely kept them to himself. But something about the young woman with the blue eyes and the mountain man with the calloused hands and the forged contracts on his desk made him listen. When Adeline finished, he picked up his magnifying glass and bent over the documents. 3 hours passed. He measured pen angles with a protractor. He examined pressure patterns under a lamp held at different inclinations. He muttered to himself in Latin and occasionally in what appeared to be profanity. Wyatt sat in a chair that was too small for him and watched with the patient stillness of a man who had spent his life waiting for animals and weather and who understood that some things could not be rushed. "Same hand," Reeves said at last, straightening with a series of pops from his spine. Every signature on those contracts was written by the same person who signed Cornelius Drayton's own purchase agreements. I have examined 47 cases in my career and never once been overturned. I will stake my professional reputation on this conclusion. He paused. But I will not travel to testify without legal protection. This Drayton of yours sounds like a man who solves problems by creating larger problems. It was Reeve who opened the door that changed everything. "I know a lawyer," he said, removing his spectacles and polishing them on his vest. "She contacted me 2 years ago about a case involving forged land documents in Black Pine Ridge. The same Drayton. She has been building a file. But she lacked the one thing every prosecutor needs, a case strong enough to go to trial. I believe you may have just brought it to her." Henrietta Vance arrived at Reeves' office the following afternoon, and Adeline understood immediately why the professor had chosen the word formidable to describe her. 44 years old, dark hair pulled back with the severity of someone who had no time for vanity. Eyes that assessed a room the way a general assesses a battlefield. She wore a dark dress of good quality but not fashionable. The dress of a woman who wanted to be taken seriously and had learned that in a courtroom full of men, every detail of appearance was either a weapon or a vulnerability. She sat down across from Wyatt and Adeline and placed her own file on the desk beside theirs. It was thick, 2 years of work, and then she told them why. Her sister's name had been Lavinia Vance. Lavinia had married a farmer named Caleb Mercer, a good man who worked honest land outside Black Pine Ridge. 5 years ago, Cornelius Drayton had presented a document showing that Caleb had signed over the water rights to his property. Caleb swore he had never signed anything, but he could not prove it because the signature on the paper looked enough like his to fool a judge who was not looking closely. And because Caleb Mercer, like so many men in that territory, could not read well enough to know what he had supposedly signed. He lost the farm, he lost the water, he lost everything except the bottle, which he found quickly and held on to tightly. Lavinia watched her husband disappear into whiskey and despair. She watched her 3 children go hungry. She wrote letters to Henrietta in Denver that grew shorter and more desperate with each passing month. And then one night in January, when the creek behind the house was frozen solid and the temperature had dropped below zero and the children were sleeping in a room she could no longer heat, Lavinia Mercer walked out the back door and down the hill and onto the ice and kept walking until the ice broke. They found her body 2 days later, caught against a fallen tree a quarter-mile downstream. Henrietta told this story without tears. She had cried for Lavinia already, in private, in the dark, in the rooms where no one could see. What remained was something harder than grief, something that had been refined in fire and would not break. I took Lavinia's children, she said, and I made a promise over her grave. I would destroy the man who killed her. If your evidence holds, she said, looking at the documents on Reeves' desk, and Bartholomew tells me it does, I can obtain a letter of safe passage from Territorial Judge Morrison. I can represent you in court free of charge. Why free? Wyatt asked. Henrietta looked at him with eyes that held 12 years of cold, patient fury. Because watching Cornelius Drayton lose everything he has taken from others is the only fee I have ever wanted. The last night before the journey back, Adeline could not sleep. She lay in her boarding house room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, the clatter of a late carriage, the distant laughter from a saloon, the bark of a dog. All of it so different from the mountain silence she had grown accustomed to. The silence of the ranch, she realized, was not really silence at all. It was a symphony played on instruments the city did not own. The creek, the wind in the pines, the wolves, the enormous breathing quiet of a world that had not yet been paved over or built upon or ruined. She missed it. She missed the ranch. She missed the kitchen table and the oil lamp and the scratch of pencils on paper and the sound of three men learning to read, each in his own way, each at his own pace, each revealing through the act of learning exactly who he was. She missed Asher's quiet smile when he finished a sentence. She missed Ridge's grudging questions asked from the far end of the table, as though proximity to knowledge was something that needed to be approached with caution. And she missed Wyatt. She missed the way he sat across from her with his brow furrowed and his jaw set, attacking each new word like a man clearing brush with an axe, refusing to be defeated by anything, least of all a collection of ink marks on paper. She knocked on his door. He opened it immediately, fully dressed, clearly not sleeping either. His boots were on, his hat sat on the windowsill. He looked like a man who had been sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall and thinking about things he did not have the words for. "Cannot sleep," she said. "Come outside with me. There is air I want to breathe." He did not ask where. He simply followed. They climbed the narrow stairs to the rooftop of the boarding house. Denver spread below them in a grid of gas lamps and dim windows and the slow movement of late carriages. Above them, the sky was wider than any sky Boston could ever offer, salted with stars that even the city's lights could not entirely erase. They stood side by side at the low parapet, both forearms on the brick, neither looking at the other. "If we lose tomorrow," Wyatt said quietly, "where will you go?" "Have not thought about it," she said. "And you?" "I will not lose." A long silence. The wind off the plains carried the smell of distant rain. "You know why," he said. "Because the land is yours. Because I have someone who can read standing next to me now." She turned her head and looked at him. "Are you talking about the courtroom," she said, "or about something else?" The pause stretched. "Mountains do not speak quickly. Neither do men from them." "Both," he said. She did not reach for him. He did not reach for her. They stood there with their shoulders almost but not quite touching, looking down at a city that was not theirs, into a future that had not yet been written. And that was how love began between them. Not with passion or urgency, with the willingness to stand beside each other on a high place at night and say the small true thing. While Wyatt and Adeline were in Denver Ridge and Asher fought a quiet war of attrition against an enemy who attacked not with bullets, but with wire cutters and poison, and the patient cruelty of a man who knew that he could afford to lose cattle and fencing indefinitely while the Calloway brothers could not. The first night after Wyatt and Adeline left, Ridge sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees and watched the darkness. He did not sleep. Sleep was a luxury for men whose land was not under siege. Asher took 3-hour shifts sleeping on the floor just inside the front door with his boots on and his hammer within reach. They communicated in the wordless language that 19 years of shared mountain life had built between them. A nod toward the north tree line meant movement. A raised eyebrow meant nothing, just wind. A hand on the shoulder held for a moment meant I am here and I am not going anywhere. Asher brought out 2 cups of coffee on the second night and set one beside Ridge without speaking. Ridge took it without speaking. They sat in the dark and drank the coffee and listened to the night sounds of the mountain and the silence between the night sounds. And in that silence, they listened for the things that should not have been there. On the second day, Ridge found the north fence cut, not torn by an animal or broken by weather. Cut cleanly, 3 strands of wire severed with clippers, the kind of damage that required tools and intention. Cattle had wandered through the gap during the night, scattering across the hillside and into the timber beyond. It took 4 hours of hard riding to round them up. 4 hours during which the house and the creek and the water supply were unguarded. Asher repaired the fence under a sun that hammered the back of his neck like a blacksmith's anvil. His hands blistered and bled from the barbed wire rewinding and splicing and re-rigging with the same meticulous care he brought to everything he built. He did not complain. In 27 years of life, Asher Calloway had never once complained about physical pain. He had learned early that complaining changed nothing and wasted energy that could be used for work. On the third day, Asher rose before dawn to water the cattle, and he found 3 of them lying beside the trough dead, their bellies distended, their eyes glazed, their legs stiff and jutting at angles that no living animal would hold. At the bottom of the trough, beneath the last inch of water, a white powdery residue clung to the wood. Poison. Arsenic most likely. The kind that could be bought at any general store for killing rats and that would kill a 1,500-pound steer just as efficiently if dissolved in his drinking water. Asher stood beside the trough for a long time looking at the 3 dead animals. He had named them. Wyatt had told him not to name livestock, had told him a dozen times that naming an animal you might eventually have to sell or butcher was a mistake. But Asher could not help it. These 3 had been Clover Dusty and Old Tom, and he had fed them every morning and scratched behind their ears and talked to them the way lonely people talk to animals when there is no one else to listen. Now they were dead because a rich man wanted the water they drank. He emptied the trough. He scrubbed it with sand and creek water until the wood was raw. He refilled it from the creek, testing the new water on his own tongue before letting the remaining cattle near it. Then he buried the 3 dead animals, digging the holes himself because Ridge was on watch and could not help, and because the work, the brutal physical labor of it, gave his grief somewhere to go. On the third night, just past midnight, Asher heard something at the creek. Not an animal. Animals moved with a rhythm that the ear learned to recognize after years on the mountain. This was the irregular, cautious sound of a human being trying not to be heard. He took the hammer and went alone because Ridge could not leave the house unguarded and because someone had to protect the water. In the moonlight, silver and cold, he found a man crouching at the edge of the creek, pouring something from a tin canister into the current. The man was large. Larger than Asher, with the bandana pulled up over his nose and a hat pulled low. The confrontation lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The man saw Asher and swung. His fist caught Asher on the left cheekbone with enough force to make the mountain tilt sideways. Asher staggered but did not fall. He brought the hammer up in a wide arc, not to strike, but to warn the heavy head whistling through the air close enough to the man's face that he could feel the wind of it. The man ran, disappeared into the trees like a shadow swallowed by larger shadows. Asher stood alone by the creek in the moonlight, his cheeks swelling, his hands trembling from the aftermath of adrenaline, and did what he always did. He cleaned, he checked the water, he made sure the source was pure. He protected the thing that kept them alive the way he had been protecting things his whole life, quietly, thoroughly, without asking for recognition. When he returned to the house, Ridge was standing in the doorway. He looked at the bruise darkening on Asher's cheek. "We should go after them." "No, we hold the house. That is the job. If they come again, we hold the house again. Wyatt trusted us with this. I will not break that trust." Ridge ground his teeth. Everything in him, every instinct honed by years of suspicion and self-defense, wanted to mount a horse and ride into the darkness and find the men responsible and make them understand that the Callaway Ranch was not a place you attacked without consequence. But Asher was right. Enrich, for all his stubbornness, knew it. "Fine," he said, "but I am sleeping with the rifle loaded." "You have been sleeping with the rifle loaded since you were 14, Asher said. "And despite everything, despite the dead cattle and the poisoned water and the bruise spreading across his face like a purple sunset," Ridge almost smiled. The fourth night was quiet. The fifth was quiet. On the morning of the sixth day, Asher walked the fence line and found nothing wrong. The cattle were grazing. The creek ran clean. Ranger had stopped trembling at every distant sound. And from the eastern ridge at midday, the small flash of a heliograph mirror told them what they had been waiting 4 days to know. Wyatt was coming home. Adeline was with him. They were not alone. Ridge lowered the brass telescope from his eye. "They have someone with them," he said. Asher did not ask who. He knew his cousin well enough to know that whoever was with them was either going to save the Callaway Ranch or get them all killed, and there was no third option left. He set down the chisel he had been sharpening. He went into the house. He put a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. He swept the porch one more time. He stood in the doorway of the small back room where Adeline had slept, and he made sure the jar of wildflowers on the table was fresh. Then he walked out into the yard and stood beside Ridge and watched the trail. Whatever was coming up that trail, they would meet it together. The way they had met everything since Aunt Prudence had buried their childhoods on the same mountain that now buried her. The train arrived at Black Pine Ridge 2 hours before dawn, when the eastern sky was the color of lead, and the western stars still burned cold and indifferent. 4 people stepped down onto the dark platform. Wyatt Callaway, his face set like stone, wearing the same clothes he had worn for nearly a week because he had not thought to pack anything else. Adeline Brentwood, her hands steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Henrietta Vance, carrying a leather case thick with enough documentation to bring down a small empire. And Professor Bartholomew Reeves, 73 years old, his magnifying glass in his vest pocket, looking like a slightly disheveled grandfather, but carrying in his head the expertise that was about to become the most dangerous weapon in Black Pine Ridge, Colorado territory. The station was the same station Adeline had arrived at weeks ago, the same warped boards, the same faded sign, but Adeline was not the same woman who had stepped off a train with a trunk and $4 and nowhere to go. That woman had been desperate. This woman was angry. That woman had been looking for a place to belong. This woman had found one and was coming back to fight for it. Sheriff Aldous Finch was waiting under the single platform lamp, its yellow light carving deep lines into his tired face, the shadows under his eyes dark as bruises. "Heard you were coming back," he said. "We are here for the trial," Wyatt said. Nothing more. Finch's eyes moved to Henrietta, then to Reeve. Brought a lawyer and a professor, playing it big. Henrietta stepped forward with the bearing of a woman who had learned to make every man who underestimated her regret it. She produced a document. I am Henrietta Vance, legal counsel for Mr. Calloway. This is Professor Bartholomew Reeve, expert witness. And this is a letter of safe passage from Territorial Judge Morrison. I trust you will honor it, Sheriff. Finch read the letter slowly, his lips moving. The color drained from his face. Does not look like I have a choice, he said. No, you do not. At the ranch, Ridge and Asher were waiting on the porch, silhouetted against the lamp burning in the window behind them. Adeline saw the cost of the separation immediately and felt it like a blow to the chest. Ridge was thinner, his cheekbones sharp under his skin, his gray-blue eyes hollow from a week of 3-hour shifts and spending every waking moment in a state of vigilance that wore the body down faster than labor. Asher had a dark bruise across his left cheek, purple shading to yellow at the edges. A bruise that was several days old and told a story without needing words. Drayton tried 3 times. Ridge reported, his voice flat and clinical. A soldier delivering a field report. Cut the north fence 2nd day, poisoned the water trough 3rd day, lost 3 head of cattle, sent a man to the creek on the 3rd night to contaminate the water source. Asher intercepted him. He glanced at his younger cousin. We held everything. The ranch is intact. The water is clean. The remaining cattle are accounted for. Wyatt stepped forward and gripped both their shoulders, right hand on Ridge, left hand on Asher. He held on for a long time, because this was not a greeting. It was gratitude expressed in the only language these 3 men needed. 19 years of shared mountain life had built between them a bond that words could only diminish. The grip said everything. Ridge looked at the group, Henrietta with her leather case, Reeve with his thick spectacles and his magnifying glass. Then Adeline standing beside Wyatt with her blue eyes steady and her jaw set. He gave a single short nod. Let us fight this. 2 days of preparation followed, intense and compressed. The cabin transformed into a command post. Henrietta covered the kitchen table with documents and notes, drilling Wyatt on his testimony for hours, teaching him how to handle hostile cross-examination, how to tell the truth without providing ammunition, how to look a man who wanted to destroy him directly in the eye and not blink. You will be asked, she said, why you only learned to read 3 months ago. The answer is not that you were ignorant. The answer is that you were never given the chance. There is a difference. Hold to it. Wyatt nodded. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He listened the way he listened to weather, the way he listened to horses, the way he listened to the small sounds of the mountain at night. Completely. Reeve worked at the far end of the table, completing his expert report. 23 dense pages of measurements and comparisons and forensic conclusions supported by 47 previous cases in which his findings had never once been overturned. He muttered to himself as he worked. Occasionally he laughed at something only he found amusing. Adeline organized every piece of evidence they had gathered. She cross-referenced each document. She built a complete timeline of Drayton's known land acquisitions and anticipated every argument the opposing lawyers might deploy. Her mind worked with the systematic precision she had learned at the Garrett Academy, each thought connecting to the next in an unbreakable chain. Ridge and Asher took turns standing guard, one always on the ridge with a telescope, the other always within reach of a weapon. On the 2nd night, hoofbeats sounded in the darkness. Not Tilton. Cornelius Drayton himself, riding alone, reining his horse at the edge of the cabin's lamplight, with the confidence of a man who had never imagined losing. Mr. Calloway, one word spoken. Last chance. The offer stands. His gray eyes move from face to face. Wyatt on the porch, Adeline beside him, Henrietta in the doorway, Reeve at his table inside, Ridge by the barn with his rifle, Asher on the step with his hammer. 6 people. Drayton counted them the way a chess player counts pieces. You are making a mistake. The only mistake, Adeline said, is believing no one would stand up. He turned to Henrietta. Miss Vance, I know about your sister. A tragedy. Do not speak her name. Henrietta's voice could have cut iron. Drayton smiled the smile of a man still certain of victory. Then he turned his horse and vanished into the night. No one slept. 6 people sat around the kitchen table, eating roasted meat and drinking black coffee. Reeve told stories from his 47 trials. Henrietta laughed for the first time since losing her sister. Ridge offered a single dry remark that drew a moment of surprised silence and then laughter from everyone. And in that small room on the eve of their fight, they became something more than allies. They became in the way that only shared danger can forge a family. Then Ridge turned to Adeline. The words came slowly, pulled from a place he had kept sealed for years. I was wrong about you. How so? I thought you would run when things got hard. I thought you were like my mother. His voice held no bitterness, only a sadness worn smooth by time. A sadness that had become part of him, the way a scar becomes part of skin. She came from the East, he said. She promised to stay. She left when I was 8, never came back. He looked at Adeline. You stayed. You are nothing like her. A pause. You are one of us. From Ridge, those 5 words were not a compliment. They were an oath. Adeline simply nodded. Across the table, she saw Wyatt watching his cousin with something that looked like gratitude. The Black Pine Ridge courtroom was a 2-story wooden building, the largest in town, with a 2nd-floor gallery that had been closed for years because the stairs were unreliable. On the morning of the trial, every seat on the ground floor was taken. Every inch of standing room along the walls was claimed, and people who could not fit inside stood on the porch and leaned against the windows, their faces pressed to the glass like children outside a candy store. Half the town had come, not because they cared about justice. Justice had been absent from Black Pine Ridge for so long that most people had stopped believing in it the way they had stopped believing in summer rain during a drought. They had come because a trial was the best entertainment available since a traveling circus had passed through 3 years prior, and because the word had spread that the Calloway boys had brought a woman lawyer from Denver, and that alone was enough to draw a crowd. Judge Mortimer Hawthorne occupied the raised bench at the front of the room. 72 years old, white hair thinning at the crown, cold eyes behind thick spectacles that he polished compulsively with a handkerchief he kept in his left breast pocket, hands that trembled slightly when they lifted the gavel, the tremor of age, not weakness, but a voice that did not tremble at all, a voice that had been sentencing men and ruling on disputes for 4 decades and had acquired the particular gravity that comes from having said things that changed the course of other people's lives. To the right of the courtroom sat Cornelius Drayton, immaculate as always, flanked by 2 lawyers from Denver, whose black suits and blank faces said everything about what they cost and nothing about what they believed. The kind of lawyers whose principles were priced by the hour. To the left sat Wyatt, Adeline, Henrietta, and Reeve. Wyatt wore the cleanest shirt he owned, which Adeline had pressed that morning with an iron borrowed from the general store owner's wife, who had wished them luck in a whisper while looking over her shoulder to make sure no one heard. Behind them in the front row, Ridge and Asher occupied space with the imposing stillness of men who were comfortable with silence and accustomed to being underestimated, which was a mistake that Drayton's lawyers would not make twice. No one chose to sit beside them. There was on either side of the Calloway cousins a gap of empty bench that said more about the respect they commanded than any introduction could have. Drayton's lead attorney opened smoothly. His name was Garrison, and he spoke with the oiled confidence of a man who had never lost a case because he had never taken one he could not win. The story he told was simple and damning. Wyatt Calloway, an illiterate rancher of no particular education or accomplishment, had signed legal contracts selling his water rights to Mr. Drayton, a respected member of the community. Now, under the dubious influence of an Eastern schoolteacher with no legal standing, Calloway wished to break those contracts. This was not justice, Garrison argued. This was regret dressed up as righteousness. 3 notary witnesses were called. Each one placed his hand on a Bible and swore under oath that he had personally observed Wyatt Calloway sign the documents in question. Their testimony was coordinated, consistent, and delivered with the rehearsed smoothness of men who had been told exactly what to say and had practiced saying it. Adeline watched the gallery from her seat. She watched heads nod along with the notary's testimony. She watched doubt gather in the eyes of people who had come hoping for a spectacle, but were now beginning to believe that the spectacle would be the humiliation of the Calloway family rather than the downfall of Drayton. The room was tilting. She could feel it shifting, the way you can feel a wagon beginning to slide on a muddy slope before it actually moves. Henrietta Vance stood up, and the air in the courtroom changed. It changed the way the air changes when a storm front crosses a ridge. Not gradually, but all at once. A shift in pressure that every person in the room felt without being able to name. I call Wyatt Calloway. He walked to the witness stand. Adeline's breath stopped. She had helped Henrietta prepare him for this moment. She had watched him practice his answers at the kitchen table, had watched him struggle to keep his voice steady when the questions turned personal, had watched him fight the instinct to look down or look away when the subject of his illiteracy arose. But preparing for a thing and doing the thing are separated by an ocean of courage. And now Wyatt Calloway was standing before every person he had ever known about to say aloud the secret he had kept for his entire adult life. Mr. Calloway, did you sign this contract? No. Did you ever sign anything with Cornelius Drayton? No. How can you be certain? Because 3 months ago I could not read well enough to understand what I would have been signing. I have never put my name on anything I could not understand. The whispers that followed swept through the courtroom like wind through tall grass. Hawthorne struck his gavel once hard. Garrison rose from his chair with the smile of a man who believed he was holding the trump card. Mr. Calloway, is it not remarkably convenient that you suddenly learned to read just in time to dispute this contract? Wyatt met the man's eyes. His gaze was steady, unhurried. The gaze of a man who had stared down blizzards that lasted a week and mountain lions that weighed more than he did, and the slow grinding poverty that comes with trying to hold land against a world that wants to take it. He was not going to be intimidated by a man in a black suit whose hands had never known a callus. Not convenient, he said. Necessary. I learned to read to protect myself from people like your client, people who use words as weapons against those who cannot read. The courtroom went silent. Every person in the room understood what Wyatt Calloway had just said, because every person in the room knew it was true, that those who could read had been taking from those who could not for as long as ink had existed, that this was not the failure of the illiterate, it was the crime of the literate. Henrietta called the first notary witness back to the stand. Describe exactly how Mr. Calloway signed. Which hand did he use? How did he hold the pen? Were the letters connected or separate? Did he sign quickly or slowly? The notary, who had been coached on what to say but not on how to handle questions about specifics he had never actually observed, answered without hesitation. Right hand, standard grip, connected letters, smooth fluid signature. He signed quickly. Henrietta turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that Mr. Calloway sign his name now in open court for the record. Hawthorne nodded. Wyatt took the pen. He wrote his name the way he had learned to write it, slowly, deliberately. Each letter formed separately, not connected, beginning each character from the bottom and working upward. The habit of someone who had taught himself to write in adulthood and treated every letter as its own careful construction. The signature he produced bore no resemblance to the one on the contract, and it bore no resemblance to what the notary had just described. As the court can see, Henrietta said Mr. Calloway writes in a manner entirely different from the signature on the contract and entirely different from the notary's sworn description. Either the witnesses lied under oath or they watched someone other than Wyatt Calloway sign his name. The courtroom erupted. Voices, movement, the sharp crack of Hawthorne's gavel. Order. Henrietta called Professor Reeve. He took the stand with the calm authority of a man who had done this 47 times and never once been found wrong. He presented his analysis with methodical precision. Letter by letter comparison, pen angle measurement using specialized tools, pressure analysis, entry and exit points for every stroke. Each finding built upon the last like stones in a wall until the wall was too high to see over. In my professional opinion, Reeves said the signatures on these contracts were not written by Wyatt Calloway. They were produced by someone with formal penmanship training, writing with fluency and consistency. The handwriting characteristics match closely with the known signatures of Cornelius Drayton himself, as recorded in publicly filed land transaction documents. One heartbeat of absolute silence. Then the courtroom detonated. Drayton shot to his feet. Lies. Fabrication. Sit down, Mr. Drayton, Hawthorne said, his voice suddenly carrying the weight of 40 years on the bench and zero tolerance remaining. Or I will have you restrained where you stand. But Cornelius Drayton had not built an empire through fraud without preparing contingencies. His attorney rose. His voice was smooth and measured, the voice of a man who knew exactly how to turn the law against the people it was supposed to protect. Your Honor, I raise an objection. The entirety of Professor Reeves' analysis relies upon documents that Miss Brentwood copied from the county records office on a Sunday when the office was closed. Documents obtained without authorization cannot be admitted as evidence. I move to have all of it excluded. Henrietta went pale. Adeline felt the ground open beneath her. She had assumed the records were public. She had assumed access meant access. She had not considered that entering an unlocked office on the wrong day could invalidate everything they had built. Hawthorne frowned. If the documents were obtained improperly, I may be compelled to exclude them. The longest pause in the history of Black Pine Ridge. Then I will take 1 hour to consider. Court is in recess. In the waiting room, small and stifling, Adeline's hands shook. My fault, she said. I did not think about authorization. Not your fault, Henrietta said, but her fingers were already tearing through her files, hunting for precedent. And then Asher stepped forward. Quietly, without announcement, he placed a small notebook on the table. It was old, its leather cover worn soft and stained with charcoal. The notebook he had kept hidden at the bottom of his trunk for years because he had been told, in the way that the world tells artists who live in practical places, that his talent had no value. That drawing did not feed cattle. That beauty did not feed anyone. He opened it. Inside were charcoal drawings of extraordinary precision. Every signature, every document, every figure and date, reproduced not from the originals but from memory, rendered by a visual recall so remarkable that the angles of the pen strokes, the variations in pressure, the subtle rhythms of the original handwriting were all faithfully captured in the artist's recreation. I drew them, Asher said. His voice was soft and unsteady because he had never shown the sketchbook to anyone who was not family. From memory. Each night after Adeline taught us, I drew what I had seen on the papers. I remembered the shapes before I understood what they meant. Drawing is how I understand the world. Henrietta stared at the notebook, then at Asher. Her eyes lit with the sudden, fierce brightness of a lawyer who has just found the gap in the fortress wall. This is independent evidence, she said, not a copy from the records office. An original work created from memory. No one can argue that a man stole his own recollections. She turned to Reeve. Professor, can you base an analysis on these drawings? Reeve studied the sketches with the attentiveness of a scholar encountering something he had never seen before. The precision is extraordinary. The handwriting characteristics are preserved. The angles, the pressure indicators. Yes, I can work with these. Court reconvened. Hawthorne addressed the room. I have considered the matter. The means by which Miss Brentwood obtained the copied documents are legally questionable. Henrietta stood. Your Honor, we submit supplementary evidence. Charcoal renderings of the signatures created entirely from visual memory by Asher Calloway constituting original artistic works with no connection to the copies made at the records office. Furthermore, we request that the court exercise its authority to subpoena the original records from the county office for direct examination. Hawthorne paused, and then without hesitation he did something that revealed for the first time who he actually was. Granted, clerk retrieve all land transition records filed by or involving Cornelius Drayton for the past 12 years. Every document. Drayton's face lost its color. His attorneys conferred in frantic whispers. The clerk returned with a wooden crate, heavy, full, 12 years of fraud packed into 3 cubic feet of paper and ink. Reeve examined the originals. 1 hour, the longest hour anyone in that courtroom had ever endured. 73 years old, bent over the table with his magnifying glass comparing stroke against stroke, curve against curve, pressure point against pressure point, cross-referencing the county originals with his earlier analysis and with Asher's charcoal drawings. The courtroom watched in absolute silence. 60 minutes of an old man's steady hand standing between justice and its absence. He raised his head. They match. Everyone. The same hand produced the signatures on the Calloway contracts and no fewer than 12 other transactions in these records. The same hand that wrote Cornelius Drayton's own signature on his legitimate purchases. The courtroom did not merely react. It broke open. Cries, the crash of a bench overturning. Drayton surged to his feet, his face dark with fury. Conspiracy. They manufactured the evidence. The evidence is county records, certified and sealed, Hawthorne said. His voice no longer trembled. It carried the full gathered weight of 40 years of jurisprudence and 12 years of patient waiting. They cannot be manufactured. He fixed Drayton with a stare that could have stopped a clock. Mr. Drayton, did you forge these signatures? Silence, the attorneys whispered. Drayton said nothing. Your silence is noted. And then Mortimer Hawthorne acted with a speed and decisiveness that shocked every person in the room, and in doing so finally revealed the truth about himself. He was not a corrupt judge. He was a patient one. For 12 years, he had known what Drayton was doing. For 12 years, he had sat on his bench and waited, because no one had ever brought him evidence strong enough to act on without being overturned on appeal. He had waited for someone brave enough, smart enough, and stubborn enough to build a case that could not be broken. Today they had come. In the matter of Drayton versus Calloway, I rule for the defendant. The contracts are fraudulent. Mr. Calloway retains full ownership of his land and all associated water rights. The gavel fell with the sound of a door slamming shut on 12 years of injustice. Furthermore, I order a full criminal investigation into every land transaction conducted by Cornelius Drayton over the past 12 years. Every transaction, every signature, every victim. He looked at Henrietta. Miss Vance, I trust you will represent the other victims. Henrietta's eyes were bright. She had not cried since the day they pulled her sister's body from the creek. Yes, Your Honor. Sheriff Finch, take Mr. Drayton into custody pending prosecution. Finch stepped forward. In his hands were the iron cuffs he had carried on his belt for years without ever having the courage to use them on the man who deserved them most. He closed them around Drayton's wrists, and as the metal clicked shut, 12 years of cowardice fell from Finch's face like a mask being removed. You have the right to remain silent, he said. I strongly suggest you exercise it. Drayton looked at Wyatt as he was led toward the door. Not with anger, not with hatred, with something closer to acknowledgement. As though in the last honest moment of a dishonest life, he was recognizing that he had been beaten by an opponent who deserved to win. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had reformed into something new. Not the same crowd that had watched Adeline's humiliation weeks ago and done nothing. A different crowd. Some cheered. Some stood motionless with shock. Some wept openly, tears falling down faces that had been holding them back for years. An elderly woman approached Wyatt, thin, frail, her hands trembling, her eyes red and raw with something that had waited a very long time to be released. My husband, she said. He lost our ranch to Drayton 5 years ago. Said he signed a paper he could not remember signing. I thought he was lying. I thought he was a fool. Her voice broke. But he was not lying, was he? No, ma'am, Wyatt said gently. He was not. Henrietta stepped forward. I will file on behalf of every family affected. It will take time, but there will be justice. By that afternoon, 17 families had come forward, each carrying the same story. Land taken, homes lost, lives upended. Each finally permitted to believe that they were not foolish, not forgetful, not to blame. They were victims, and someone had finally stood for them. Ridge stood at the edge of the crowd watching. A young woman, the daughter of one of the victims, approached him. How did you find the courage to stand up? Ridge considered the question for a long time. Then he looked across the crowd to where Adeline stood beside Wyatt, the woman he had refused to trust on the day she arrived, the woman who had proven every one of his doubts wrong. Because someone believed we were worth it, he said. Asher sat on the courthouse steps with his sketchbook on his knees drawing. The moment Drayton was led away. The moment Wyatt reached under the table and took Adeline's hand. The moment Ridge said she was one of them. The drawings were more than accurate. They were alive with feeling. Asher did not just remember shapes, he remembered what they felt like. The 6 of them rode home that afternoon beneath a sky that had begun to soften into the long blue of late autumn. The aspens on the lower slopes had turned gold in the weeks they had been away. The creek ran high and bright. The mountain stood where it had always stood, indifferent to the small dramas of the people who lived in its shadow, but somehow that day seeming almost to nod at them as they passed beneath it. Henrietta and Reeves stayed one night. Dinner was simple: roasted meat, potatoes, whiskey that Wyatt had hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn for an occasion that had never come until now. Ridge claimed he had known about it all along. Asher mentioned quietly that Ridge had helped himself twice over the years. Ridge denied it without much enthusiasm. For one evening, 6 people who had been strangers a month earlier sat in a small room on the side of a mountain and laughed, and the sound traveled through the open window and across the dark valley and dissolved into the vast Colorado night. When the guests had gone to bed, the 4 of them remained. Wyatt, Adeline, Ridge, Asher, the lamp burning low, the stove reduced to embers. "We won," Wyatt said. "We won," Asher echoed, as if hearing it twice made it real. "What now?" Ridge asked. "Now we rebuild," Wyatt said. "We make this place what it always should have been." He turned to Adeline. "And I want to ask you to stay. Not as a teacher, not as an employee, but as one of us." "As one of us," Ridge said. Wyatt looked at him startled. Ridge shrugged. "That is what you were going to say." "Yes, then say it." Asher smiled, a full, unguarded smile that lit his entire face. Adeline looked at the 3 men, the one she loved, the 2 who had become her brothers. "I will stay," she said, "on one condition. Name it. We build a school. Free. Open to anyone who wants to learn." "We cannot afford that," Wyatt said. "We will together." She took his hand. "You taught me something. That being rejected for who you are only means you were in the wrong place, and that finding the right place, the right people, makes everything else worthwhile." 3 months later, a schoolhouse stood at the center of the Callaway Ranch. And it was the most beautiful thing Asher Callaway had ever built. Every board fitted tight, every nail driven true. The windows faced east to catch the morning light because Adeline had told him students learn best in morning light. The door was wide enough for 2 people to pass through side by side because a school should never make you squeeze through alone. And on the leg of every desk, solid pine desks built to outlast the students who sat at them, Asher had carved a single letter of the alphabet. 26 desks, 26 letters, a silent, unsigned gift that no one noticed until Adeline bent down one morning to pick up a drop and pencil and found the letter A, carved into the wood with the precision of a jeweler and the love of an artist. She had to step outside and stand on the porch for several minutes, looking at the mountains through blurred eyes before she could trust herself to go back in. 15 students came on the first day. Ranch hands whose leathery hands had never held a pencil. Farmers' children who walked 3 miles each way because their parents understood that reading was not a luxury but a lifeline. Women who had been told their whole lives that learning was not for them, who had been cheated by merchants because they could not read a price tag, who had signed papers they did not understand because no one had ever taught them what the words meant. And men, grown men with gray in their beards, who had carried the shame of illiteracy for decades the way a man carries a wound that never heals, who finally found the courage to say the words Wyatt Callaway had said first. "I cannot read. Teach me." Adeline taught during the days. She was patient the way her mother had been patient. She was firm the way her father had been firm. And she never once made a student feel small for what they did not know, because she understood that admitting ignorance is one of the bravest things a human being can do. Each evening when the last student had departed and the sun was sinking behind the mountains in a blaze that turned the sky to fire and gold and deep aching crimson, fading through violet into the first pale stars, Wyatt sat at a desk in the empty classroom and practiced his writing. Better every day. Stronger, more confident. The trembling in his hands that had plagued him during those first lessons at the kitchen table was gone, replaced by a steadiness that came from practice in the growing realization that the thing he had feared and been ashamed of for half his life was something he could overcome. He was not stupid. He had never been stupid. He was a man without opportunity who had been given one, and he had seized it with the full force of his will. Ridge did not sit in the classroom. He stood watch outside, leaning against the porch post, a habit too deep to break. But some evenings, when he thought no one could see, he picked up one of the books Adeline left on the porch railing and read it slowly, his lips moving with each word, his calloused finger tracing the lines the way a man traces a trail through unfamiliar country, carefully, deliberately. He never admitted what he was doing. He never asked for help. Adeline placed a new book on the railing every Monday morning and never said a word about it. And this silent arrangement between the woman who taught and the man who would not admit he was learning became one of the quietest and most beautiful relationships in Black Pine Ridge. Asher drew more freely, more boldly, more beautifully than ever before. He drew the ranch in every season. Spring with wildflowers blooming along the fence where Aunt Prudence had planted the first ones. Summer with the meadow golden and the creek running high. Autumn with aspens turning gold against dark pines. Winter with snow on the peaks and smoke rising straight from the chimney into a sky so cold and blue it looked like it might crack. He drew portraits. Wyatt at his desk with the lamplight on his concentrated face. Ridge on the porch pretending not to read. Adeline at the blackboard with chalk dust on her fingers and her blue eyes bright with the key of someone doing exactly what they were born to do. He sent several drawings to a Denver newspaper at Adeline's insistence. They were published. For the first time in his life, Asher's gift was seen beyond the borders of his mountain. He no longer kept his sketchbook hidden. He left it on the kitchen table open where anyone could see it. The wedding took place on a Saturday in October beneath the old oak on the hill above the ranch. From that spot, you could see the entire valley, the creek shining in autumn sun, the meadow gold and green, the mountains stretching in every direction. Range behind a range of blue fading into sky until the distinction between earth and heaven dissolved, and there was only distance and light, and the feeling that the world was larger and more beautiful than any single life could hold. Every family they had helped came. 17 families, each bringing a dish, a word of thanks, a smile that carried the weight of rescued lives. The old woman whose husband had lost their ranch stood in the front row. Henrietta Vance stood beside Reeve, who had traveled from Denver for the occasion. Ridge served as best man without having been asked because some roles do not need invitations. Asher stood at Wyatt's other side, holding the ring he had helped forge, a silver ring made from ore pulled from his own land. The land that belonged to the Calloway family by law and by right, and by the labor of 19 years, and by the courage of 6 people who had refused to let it be stolen. Adeline wore a white dress she had sewn herself, simple, clean, not the dark blue dress of a rival chosen to impress a man who would reject her. This dress was chosen for herself alone. Wyatt wore a clean shirt and a dark coat. His hands were steady. When the preacher asked if she would take this man, Adeline did not hesitate. Yes. Not because she needed him, not because he had rescued her, but because together they had proven what the world refuses to believe, that love is not one person completing another. It is 2 people choosing to grow side by side, to fight the same battles, to build something neither could build alone. And that being rejected for your intelligence, your strength, your refusal to make yourself smaller so that others might feel large is not an ending. It is the moment you stop trying to fit inside a definition someone else wrote and begin at last to write your own. The kiss was brief and private. The wind moved across the meadow. The aspens flickered gold in the sun. A hawk turned slowly above the ridge. 3 years later, on a quiet evening in early autumn, The schoolhouse glowed with lamplight at the center of the ranch. Inside, the sound of adult voices working through unfamiliar words, the slow sounding out of syllables, the patient correction of a soft voice at the front of the room. A man in his 50s reading aloud from a primer for the first time. A woman in her 30s writing her own name on a slate. Adeline stood at the blackboard, chalk on her fingers, her blue eyes bright. There was the faintest beginning of silver at her temples now, and the smallest of lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled. She was more beautiful than she had been on the platform that first afternoon. The kind of beauty that only comes to people who have found the work they were born for. Wyatt sat in the back row, not in the teacher's chair, the student's chair, a book open in front of him, a pencil in his hand. He was 38 years old. He read at the level of a college man now. He had no need to be in the classroom. He came every evening anyway. Outside on the porch of the schoolhouse, Ridge stood beneath the rising moon, a book open in his hands, his lips moving silently with the words. He did not look up when the door opened behind him. Adeline placed a fresh volume on the porch railing, walked back inside without speaking. Ridge waited until she had gone, then closed the book in his hands, set it down, picked up the new one, opened to the first page. In the workshop 100 yards away, lamplight burned through the window. Asher was inside carving a letter into the leg of a new desk for a new student. The chisel moved with the same tender care it had moved with 3 years before when he had carved the first letter A. He had carved hundreds of letters since then. He would carve hundreds more. The narrator's voice arrived softly as though spoken by the mountain itself, settling over the valley in the language older than words. People say a strong man is a man who needs no one. But Wyatt Calloway taught an entire stretch of Colorado mountain country the opposite. That real courage is not the absence of need. It is the willingness to name what you do not know, and the bravery to learn it. Adeline Brentwood arrived at Black Pine Ridge as a bride no one wanted, with a trunk, $4, and a Bible inscribed in her mother's careful handwriting. She stayed as a teacher, a fighter, a woman who helped bring down a tyrant and helped build a future where knowledge was not a privilege but a right. And when years later people would ask whether she regretted any of it, the humiliation on the platform, the rejection, the long, difficult road that followed Adeline would smile. Because that rejection had led her here, to Wyatt, to Ridge and Asher, to a purpose she had carried inside her all along without knowing its name, to the life she had always been meant to live, found in the last place she had ever expected, on a mountain in Colorado, with 3 men who could not read, but who understood in a language older than words what it means to love. And she would not have changed a single moment, not one. Far above the schoolhouse, beyond the lamplight, and the small voices learning their letters beyond the workshop, where a chisel still moved over fresh pine, beyond the porch where a man read in silence and refused to admit he was reading, the mountain kept its old patient watch. The creek ran on. The wolves called from the high ridges in voices older than any human song, and the stars came out one by one over a valley that had finally, after a long generation of waiting, become exactly what it was meant to be. A place where the rejected were welcomed, where the silenced were heard, where the unteachable at last learned, and where the man who could not read his own betrayal had read his way letter by letter into the only victory that had ever truly mattered, the victory of a life he had chosen with his own hands, written in his own name, in his own steady, careful, beautiful script.